All righty, I think we'll get started. So as I said, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are in the world, joining us today. Appreciate everybody being here. For our November webinar, we're going to dive into the world of OT cybersecurity insurance. This is a topic that has become much more prevalent in conversations we've been having with large industrial organizations in the past 6 to 9 months, particularly. Obviously, insurance has always been a topic, but in the last 6 to 9 months, a lot of change has happened in the insurance markets, and that is now flowing through into people responsible for OT security. So we're going to do a deep dive here into the insurance world a little bit. To be transparent, I'm not an insurance expert. But really what we're going to be talking about today is less about how do you negotiate an insurance contract and more about what are we going to need to do in OT cyber to ensure that the organizations that we work for are able to get insurance and able to get insurance at a reasonable price, and how insurance fits within an overall OT cybersecurity strategy. So with that, we'll dive in. Just by way, again, of introduction for those of you who may not have joined one of our prior webinars, my name is John Livingston. I'm the CEO of Verve Industrial. Verve has been around for about 30 years or so. I've been here for about 6. I spent 20 some odd years with McKinsey & Company, where I was a senior partner helping clients go through broadly technology transformations, digital transformations. Verve has, as I mentioned, been around for about 30 years, started as a control systems integration firm, helping industrial companies design their control systems. About 15 years ago, the company developed what we call the Verve Security Center, which is a software platform to help clients manage their OT security or ICS security. And it was built by those engineers who were control systems engineers. So it's very much sort of from the control systems back. And essentially what it does is it brings IT security into the world of OT. So it's very much purpose-built for OT, but allows for IT-like capabilities in that OT environment. And then we also offer a range of services around that. And so as we talk today, what you'll hear a lot is how we're experiencing this question around insurance with our clients. So this comes from that experience through Verve of how are clients dealing with the insurance challenges, what are they seeing, and how are they addressing it. So with that, so 3 broad topics to talk about today. So number 1 is cybersecurity insurance as a management tool as part of your overall OT cybersecurity strategy. But there are significant challenges with the cybersecurity insurance market right now, and we're going to talk about that at the beginning. Secondly, then, we're going to talk about how that relates specifically into the industrial environments and how that is going to force organizations to likely shift their OT cybersecurity strategies as a result, because insurance requirements are different from regulatory requirements. They're different from a standard that you may have selected. While they relate to those standards, the things that we'll need to do to ensure that we have cover is a little different. And so we're going to talk about that. And then finally, we're going to talk about how have we seen clients actually achieve the kinds of requirements that insurance companies are now looking for to ensure that the insurance coverage actually covers an event on the OT or ICS side of things. So those are the 3 topics we're going to run through today. So to start with, insurance is part of a broader cybersecurity strategy, right? So as we think about how we're going to ensure our, the financial or operational resilience against cyber threats, right? We have a series of layers, and this isn't quite, I wouldn't call this defense in depth, but there is a series of layers that we want to add on here. So obviously, we want to start with training and awareness. We want to make people aware of things and make sure that they know what they should be doing and shouldn't be doing. But as we all know, people don't always do what they're supposed to do. And so then we put in protection elements, right? So we say, okay, let's protect ourselves to the extent we can. And on the IT side, that may be through, filters around phishing emails, et cetera. And that includes firewalls. It includes patching of systems. It includes hardening of configurations, et cetera. So we protect things. We put in antivirus and whitelisting and EDR tools. The next thing we do is we detect. So, okay, we may not be able to protect everything, right? So there are 0 days out there. Even if we patched everything to the latest patch, we still may not catch it, right? Or in our protections in OT particularly, well, there may not always be a protection for that particular threat. And so we then layer on detection, whether that be host intrusion detection, network intrusion detection, et cetera. But we're gonna monitor and hopefully detect threats that we didn't necessarily protect from getting into the environment. And then, in worst case scenario, we have a disaster recovery. So something happens, we didn't protect against it, we didn't detect it, and we have an event. And so we've got backups, we've got incident response. We try to respond to that event after the fact. And then beyond that, we say, well, okay, if we couldn't protect it and it got in and we didn't detect it and it took us out, well, okay, do we have operational resilience? It really isn't a cyber thing. It's more about our broader supply chain. So we have backup parts of our supply chain. So not one plant is the only one that makes a particular SKU, so that we have some operational resilience in case of having a significant outage. And then finally, if that ends up failing, we then have cybersecurity insurance to cover financial losses should we not be able to stop that threat in some other way. Now, this is a bit of from a framework point of view, this is a bit too simple, so to speak, right? Because cybersecurity insurance also helps us in the disaster recovery part of this, right? If we have insurance, it can cover part of the costs of disaster recovery. But the concept here is that as we think about layers, there are certain things we can stop, but there are going to be certain things that we can't. And so we want to have insurance to cover us in case of those kinds of events where we need to either pay out ransoms or other things, or alternatively to help us recover from a stoppage of our operations. But it is part of our overall strategy. We need to be thinking about, okay, we may want to spend a certain amount on technology, for instance, or on people, but there may be some risks which we cannot guarantee we can stop. And so those are the things we want to insure against. The reality is that insurance is a key element of the overall strategies. And what we're seeing is the projections of growth. Now, what's interesting is we look at it where it is today, about $100 million market in the, if we think about specifically the industrial segments of, power and water and et cetera. That's growing pretty dramatically. According to Guidehouse, it would grow. It's going to grow about 16% annually over the next 10 years or so. But today, it's still a pretty small market, right? It's still not a huge dollar amount when you think about the world of cyber insurance. Just to give you a sense, the total cyber insurance market is about $6 billion, and of a total like a $5 trillion insurance market. So cyber insurance overall is still relatively small, and cyber insurance in OT is even smaller, but it is growing very quickly. People are starting to realize the need for this as part of their OT security strategy. In addition, some of the standards, which is great, right? Some of the standards are now starting to include insurance as part of the standards definition. So in the ISO 27X, 27,000, 27,001, et cetera, they now have a standard 27,102, which is guidelines for adopting cyber insurance as a risk treatment option. And so it outlines different procedures that can be handled to implement as part of measures that insurers are likely to need. And it looks at the types of losses that are insured and the safeguards that must be in effect to accommodate, meaning what are the requirements that you have to have as an organization to be able to get cover or insurance, to be able to get coverage for the risks that you want to insure. And the information security risk management frameworks, it provides the insured and the insurer with the kinds of data, paperwork, records, et cetera, that can be used in any of the implementation of a cybersecurity policy. And so this is very helpful because it starts to say, okay, what are the kinds of things that we're going to need to do to be able to ensure that we're able to get coverage? And the good news is the insurance companies are laying out a set of good news, bad is spending, I hate to think about it. They are laying out a set of requirements that we're going to have to achieve to be able to get cyber insurance. And we're going to talk more about that in detail. But we now are starting to get the standards doing that. However, this is a challenging space right now for CFOs and others involved in gathering and getting this insurance, or chief risk officers, whatever. So if we look at the Council of Insurance Agents and Brokers, what we've seen is the cybersecurity insurance rates are going up at about a 25% clip every quarter. And this is a dramatic increase. For the last 5 quarters, they've been increasing at about 25%. In addition, the coverage has been going down, right? So if we look in basically the back end of 2021, the limits have been reduced from about 10 million down to around 5 million. And obviously these are averages, right? We're not, this isn't every single policy. But to the extent you're not dealing with this on a day-to-day basis, if you're trying to do OT cyber and you're hearing from the CFO or the chief risk officer about insurance, this is what they're experiencing. So when we think about how are we going to fit insurance into our strategy, a few things happen, right? So A, we are going to have more requirements to get the insurance. It's harder to get. But 2, the cost of the insurance is going up. Therefore, we're going to need to think about other controls, protection, detection, et cetera, because I had a certain level of investment that I could spend on those other controls, and then I would take the rest with insurance. Now insurance has gone up in price. And so therefore, I need alternatives. I need other ways to protect. I may be willing to spend more money on protection because the cost of the insurance has actually gone up. So anyway, this is a major challenge, not just in OT, but this is a major challenge broadly in the cybersecurity space. In addition to those increases, there are a range of various gaps or issues with some of these policies. So silent cyber. So what this means is there's a question mark of whether cyber is covered in traditional property and loss insurance, right? If you've gotten a cyber event, is that really covered? Is it a quote unquote silent cyber event? And what's happening is insurers are now coming in and saying, wait a minute, we didn't intend to include cyber. So they're excluding those silent cyber components from their property and loss and saying, if you want the cyber insurance, you're going to have to pay specifically for that. 2, cyber policies often are now excluding OT unless it's explicitly included. So the Colonial Pipeline event, frankly, the Maersk and Merck, NotPetya events several years ago, have all raised the awareness of the risks of industrial environments. And so more and more insurers are saying, no, if you want OT to be part of this, or you want your control systems to be part of this, you have a whole separate set of requirements around that. We're going to talk more about this, but there's a set of exclusions that Lloyd's is now recommending around acts of war. I won't go into that right now because we're going to spend a little bit more time on that. Question around physical damage. So is the cyber security insurance actually covering a physical event, meaning your mill blows up, or something like that, or a paper machine gets destroyed, or a turbine gets destroyed. Is that included, or is it not? Many times those physical damages may be excluded. Lost profits, et cetera. So as we think about this insurance, particularly in the industrial environments, we need to think really specifically about what are we insuring and what is being excluded in that policy. So I'm just going to touch on this acts of war because this is a pretty substantial change. So Lloyd's of London, the big reinsurance market, has basically come out and said they are going to require that all standalone cyber policies include a clause that limits liability arising from any quote unquote act of war, any state-backed cyber attack. And it must exclude losses arising from that significantly impair the ability of a state to function on one hand, or that significantly impair the security capabilities of a state. But then when you get into the example exclusions of these, and there are 3 options that Lloyd's gives, basically this is what is going to be in the policies if you want to reinsure it through Lloyd's. And that is that the insurance does not cover any loss, et cetera, for war or cyber operations carried out in the course of war, retaliatory cyber operation by a state. Cyber operation has a major detrimental impact on the functioning of a state or the security. And what's interesting about this is that the primary factor in doing this is determining is whether the state attributed the cyber operation. But in the event that the government of the state does not do that, so this is number 5, basically they don't do it in a certain amount of time, or they don't do it at all, or they declare it's unable to, then it's basically up to the courts and the insurer to prove this, which basically this gets into the whole question of, okay, if we have another NotPetya type event, or an event where North Korea or Iran or somebody releases some form of a ransomware that gets out in the wild, is that an act of war or is it not? And is the US government or other governments going to determine that that's an act of war, or is this going to be left unknown, right? Is it going to be attributed? So this is raising the bar on attribution by the various governments, but it also raises the bar when we think about what are we going to try and insure and what are the risks that we have, right? So essentially this insurance market is becoming tighter and tighter, or quote unquote harder and harder, as the insurers have losses and are trying to essentially define how they want to insure. But what this means for all of us as operators is greater challenges and the need for more intense focus on how exactly we are insured and what we're insured for. So that's kind of the background on the broader cybersecurity insurance space. Let's dive into a little bit on the industrial side. So for those of you who have been on our prior webinars, you may have seen this before, but I think it's important as we think about industrial organizations, right? Manufacturing is now the most targeted industry, right? So it's no longer banks, it's now manufacturers. And energy companies have gone from 9 a couple of years ago to 3 or 4 today. So we're seeing a pretty big shift in where attackers are targeting for cyber events. And when you look at the costs of this, right? These are a couple of the NotPetya examples as well as the Locker Goga examples. These are big dollars. Big dollars, because supply chains get destroyed. We have obviously IT that needs to be rebuilt. We have costs of product, potentially product having to be thrown away in the case of Merck, or we have ships that can't move in the case of Maersk, et cetera, et cetera. And so the financial impact of those attacks is substantial. And if you think about the financial impact, it's not just the financial impact on the company, right? So the Colonial Pipeline example is probably the most extreme example that we've had, but it's not, it's not a huge outlier in terms of what could happen, because so many industrial organizations are so interwoven into our economy that we have externalities happen, right? So it was $4 million for Colonial Pipeline in ransom payment, but it was a $2 to $3 billion economic impact. And so if you were dependent on Colonial Pipeline, is insurance going to cover you or not? How does that work? And if instead of Colonial Pipeline being the attack, if that was a vendor of yours and the attack got into your environment, are you insured? Are you non-insured, et cetera? So these OT events can have significant externalities. And what we're seeing more and more is those threats move from IT into OT. There's a lot of focus on OT, pure OT cyber, which is important. But when we think about ransomware, it oftentimes, 90 some odd % of the time, is going to start in IT. The ransomware is going to exploit vulnerabilities, et cetera. And then it's going to jump across into OT through weak ACLs, dormant users, et cetera, like the example of Colonial Pipeline. And down then, it can quickly move throughout the OT environment. So in Colonial Pipeline case, they just shut it down so it couldn't move. But without those controls in place on OT, it can move very, very rapidly. And so this is what we have to deal with on the OT side to given the number of threats on the in those environments. And what we're seeing is that the driver of these threats is really ransomware. So these are surveys, the SANS ICS survey from the last couple of years. And obviously, and this basically surveys ICS security practitioners and asks them, okay, how risky is OT? Well, the severity of the risk has grown dramatically. But most interestingly is what's on the right. If you look at ransomware and financially motivated attacks, it's gone from 6th or 7th on the list to number 1 by far over the last few years. And the reason for that is it goes back to that first chart, right? This is what's driving that growth. And so as we think about this as industrial organizations, this is who we're up against now, right? We are up against a group of financially motivated attackers who know that if I shut down a process or a manufacturing facility or whatever, the financial price that a company is going to pay for that is pretty substantial. And so therefore, as we think about insurance, we got to figure out how to insure that because we are now under threat. It's no longer just the banks. And so from a cybersecurity insurance point of view, this is why Guidehouse is showing such a large growth in the industrial environments. And insurance, we've been focused on that today, and that's what we're really talking about today because of the increasing risk premiums and the quote unquote hard, which is the way that the insurance industry talks about it, essentially meaning tight or rising prices, decreasing coverage. But there are a range of other things going on in the OT security environment as well, right? The attackers themselves, IT kind of crossing over, bringing more vulnerabilities, frankly, with it, regulatory requirements that are increasing, the resource constraints we have, et cetera. And boards of directors are all over this now. So there's a range of other reasons beyond insurance why we need to think differently about OT cyber. But insurance is a big driver of that. And so as we think about what we're going to do, we need to understand what is it that the insurance companies are going to require. And so I mentioned before about these exclusions in policies, and one of those is around OT. And so what's happening is we're seeing more and more of this, and you all may have already received these from your insurance brokers or vendors. They're asking for additional OT supplementary application. So great, I've got my application for IT, and here's all the things I do in IT. And they're saying, great, thank you for that. Now, if you want coverage for your manufacturing environments, your power, your water, whatever, for the ICS part of that or the OT part of that, you have to fill out this additional application. And that additional application, we've tried to summarize it here. It's 4 or 5 pages long. But to summarize it, right, it basically goes through a set of requirements around things like, number 1, a complete and up-to-date centrally held asset inventory. Number 2, do you have a process for vulnerability and patch management? And if not, and also for, do you have devices that are end of life, and what are you going to do with those? And if you're not able to patch something, can you describe what are the compensating controls that you have? Are you using a network protection? Do you have whitelisting on each asset? Do you have updated antivirus? Whatever it is that you're using as compensating controls. Is OT segmented from the internet? And is it segmented within the perimeter of OT? So not just from the IT side, but do you have sub-segmentation, and how? They want to actually understand, how is that segmented? Is it done through firewalls? Is it done through VLANs? How is that done? Next, do you permit employees and third parties to remotely access? And if so, what are you doing on that? How is it being done? What is your MFA? Are you sure that people have to go through that? All sorts of questions around, do you have local accounts that people could access without going through the MFA process? Do you assess and monitor? And they ask for a range of things that you might do, from risk assessments to pen testing to intrusion detection, et cetera. Backups, big topic. Do you conduct them at least on a monthly basis? And do they include things like non-Windows, so networking devices, embedded devices? Do you create offline copies, et cetera? Then there's some resourcing questions about dedicated resources to OT and budgeting. Have you done tabletops? And then finally, policies and procedures. Now, you could check yes, 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 yes on all of these and, risk it. But the reality is, if there's ever an event, they're going to come back and look. And in fact, oftentimes these insurance firms will audit whether or not the responses are correct. And as you look at these requirements, now, if somebody's been doing OT cybersecurity for a long time, these are somewhat familiar topics, right? These aren't new things. By the same token, all of a sudden, the idea of, okay, well, I'm just going to put a firewall in place and I'm protected, or alternatively, I'm going to just monitor network traffic and I'm protected, it doesn't quite live up to what's going to be required from an insurance point of view. So given that, what do we do, right? If we're saying, A, cybersecurity insurance is very important, it's a key part of our overall program, we want it to cover OT as well. Number two, we're having significant additional requirements or additional application information is necessary. How do we deliver that? How do we achieve those kinds of things? Because it may be different than what we're doing today. The good news about this is these things are not new, right? Whether you use the NIST cybersecurity framework, you use CIS, you use, frankly, almost any of the standards, they're going to be similar kinds of things, right? It's asset inventory. Do you have an asset inventory? Yeah. Comprehensive view of identifying, right? I know my hardware, I know my software, I know my users. I have identified risks through tabletop exercises. Protect, things like patching and vulnerability management, access control, network segmentation, things like detect, OT monitoring, being able to respond through policies and procedures, et cetera, and then being able to recover with backups and making sure those backups are up to date, et cetera. The reality is that those things in the application didn't come out of nowhere. They came out of good frameworks. So as we think about how we're going to address those needs, we can fall back on some of these frameworks that maybe many organizations have at least started with on the IT side and are starting to work through on OT side. How do we do that? So what we've seen be helpful is to be able to bring that data, that program, I'll call it, into a common platform to enable you to be able to demonstrate the answers to those insurance questions from one place, right? And so that starts with the asset inventory piece, right? So being able to get not 70%, not 60%, but 100% of your assets. We hear from a lot of organizations, yeah, we've got we moved off of spreadsheets, which is great. And we now have a tool and we've got about 70% coverage. Well, That's not what's being asked, right? It's being asked, do you have 100% coverage? Vulnerability management then. So being able to know vulnerabilities without having to scan, without having to use IT type tools, which could disrupt operations. Then patching, right? Can you actually execute patches? And do you know which patches are relevant within that environment? So the next part of the platform includes patch management. Similarly with configuration management, are you able to manage the way that that device is set up so that you can identify compensating controls when you can't patch? Users and accounts, similarly, do I know all the users and accounts? Am I managing that remote access into those accounts? They ask about EDR and AV tools, right? And so being able to integrate and be clear, yes, I have AV. Yes, it's up to date. It may be that each OEM has their own preferred version. And so I can't have one standard across all of my plants, let's say. But by having a platform, you can pull all of that data in one place so you can actually manage McAfee and Symantec and Sophos and all the various AV tools you have to cover the various vendors in one place. So you can be able to respond quickly to insurance questions, et cetera. Intrusion detection. So being able to ensure that you're monitoring assets on a regular basis, et cetera. And then incident response. So do you know backup status? Are we regularly doing backups as required, et cetera? So by bringing this into a platform, it starts to enable an organization not only to be secure, which is obviously the key point of all of this, but also to be able to demonstrate the kinds of things we will need to for insurance. So that starts with a really deep asset inventory. As I mentioned, success is not, 70%. And then being able to not only know, that there's an asset, but to know things about it, right? What are the network connections? What are the network device configurations? So you say you've got segmentation, okay? What are the configs in those firewalls? When you say the VLANs are separating, what are the configurations in those switches? And are those VLANs actually operating as we intended? Being able to see patch status, actual patch, not just the version of the OS, but the actual patch status on that device, all the KBs, et cetera, to be able to do your vulnerability management, et cetera. Right. So having that deep asset inventory is critical from an insurance point of view, and obviously from a security point of view. And then this notion of what we call think global, act local. So being able to, in that insurance application, the big key was asset inventory centrally managed. So not each site has an asset inventory, but that all comes up to the top. And so the reason this is important is when that new vulnerability shows up, right? So Rockwell releases some vulnerability on their system. Do you know where that device is everywhere? So in other words, it's got a certain firmware, it's got a certain make and model. Can you find that device across your enterprise quickly and then do something about it? And so having that scaled analytics, so getting all of the site data up to one place, data around inventory, data around patching, data around vulnerabilities, data around logs and alerting, et cetera. But then in an OT world, we need to then make the actions local, right? So for those of you who are control systems engineers, you know that the risks of having someone try and patch a system from 3,000 miles away. The timing may be wrong. It may reboot the system when it shouldn't, et cetera. And so whatever platform we use needs to be able to think global, i.e. bring that data centrally. But when we try and act, it needs to be done locally. And we need to automate that local action. And this is one of the things we do in our platform, but whatever platform you're going to choose, making sure that you can automate those local actions, but put that in the control of people who understand the process. So you're not tripping the plant in the hope of doing something good from a security point of view. And so in our view, the only way we're going to do this is we have to get to the endpoint, meaning we can't rely just on network data, network traffic, et cetera, to get this done. So there's some myths about, all of this that have been percolating around. So, hey, if we just grab network traffic, that'll be enough for visibility. And the reality is it's not, right? It first of all, it doesn't go deep into the environment, right? You get 60, 70% of assets. You're not going to get through a backplane of a PLC, for instance. But two, the data that you're going to get is going to have gaps, meaning a patched data. You're not going to get patched data off the wire, for instance. The second myth is that agents are not safe in OT. And that's not true, right? Agents are perfectly safe if they're designed for OT systems and are tested on various platforms before they're deployed. We've been doing agents for 15 years, right? And never, ever had any issue on any vendor systems. But you have to build that with the knowledge of control systems. You're not going to go throw CrowdStrike on there tomorrow, right? It has to be specific to the OT environment. But that agent approach allows you to get the detailed data you need, and also eventually to be able to take actions when you need to. A third myth: active communication to devices causes disruption. Yeah, you can't do an active communication to a PLC or a controller. And the reality is we've been doing control systems work for 30 years, right? How do you program control systems? You connect to them, right? You connect them in the protocols that the vendors use, right? You go through the Siemens or the Rockwell or the Honeywell HMI to talk to it, right? But we talk to them all the time. And so as long as we can build a active communication to those devices in their native protocols, there's no risk, right? We can talk to them and we can gather back the key data from those devices. We just have to do it safely, the way that people who understand control systems, understand the protocols, make that work. And then finally, when we think about network architecture and are we segmented or not, right? You could say, well, the flows are enough. Well, no, they're really not, because the flows could be, operating just as we like it, but there's a rule buried in that config that would allow a different flow. And so we need to understand potential traffic, not just current. And so our view on this is you have to get to the endpoint. And the great news is you can get to the endpoint safely, effectively, no issues with operations, at frankly a much lower cost than trying to get it from network data. Not to say that network's not important. We're not saying that at all. Network is very helpful for monitoring of risks and threats in different ways. But to do true OT security management, we eventually got to get to the endpoint. So we talk about the first question in that survey is, can we centralize that? Do you have an asset database, asset inventory across all of your sites, all of your enterprise? And so the first thing is we have to be able to bring that together. So in this example, right, we've got 3 different sites up at the top, Milwaukee, Detroit, et cetera. And okay, how many assets do I have there? And then, we're not here to kind of walk through the whole clicking on all of this, but the point is this allows us to know exactly what assets we have, the types of assets, the various VLANs that they're on, et cetera, et cetera. So being able to centralize that across, in this case, 3 sites, you could do it across hundreds of sites, allows us to know, to check that box, so to speak, and know what assets we have. The second piece is, do you have vulnerability and patch management? Well, we need to get the vulnerability data, right? And the starting point, obviously, is having CVEs, right? So do we know the actual vulnerabilities in our system? Not, do we have some probability that a vulnerability exists, but do we know that vulnerability is present in that software, whether that be an OS version, an application, a firmware version, whatever. And so being able to see across asset types, across sites, how many critical vulnerabilities do I have? How many high vulnerabilities? And then by asset, which is along the bottom there in that histogram, right? For each asset, what's my total risk score of those assets? So this just starts a starting point of, okay, we need to have vulnerability data, and we need to do this OT safe, right? We can't be scanning this with a traditional IT scan technology because you're going to trip the plant, right? So being able to gather that OT data, again, from the endpoint, so we know that it's certain, is key to that, to being able to, both for security as well as for dealing with insurance. And then similarly with patch status, right? So how are we patched or not, right? And for each asset, can we prioritize this? One of the big issues that we often see when we start to go into apply OT security practices is, there's literally thousands of vulnerabilities and hundreds of patches that need to be deployed because these systems haven't been patched in years. So how do we prioritize, right? So which assets have the most patches? Can we do kind of an 80-20 on it, right? And then, how many CVEs, critical CVEs, are covered by that particular patch? And obviously we can bring in things like whether that CVE has exploits and whether it's in the Syste database, et cetera. But being able to know how much are we getting, right? How much progress are we making? And then also obviously looking for vendor approval. So making sure that you can bring in the list of approved patches, because not every patch will be approved by that vendor. And so by having this platform notion, I can answer the question for the insurance companies and say, yes, we have a patch management system. We have a vulnerability management system. We know what we're going to patch when. And from a security point of view and an efficiency point of view, we can start to prioritize which are the most important things to get started on. The next question is, okay, well, if you're not able to patch something, what are your compensating controls? And so this is where this notion of a platform and bringing the data together really comes into play, because if I have it all in the same place, we can create a risk score, right? We can create an overall risk view of each asset. If we can't patch it, okay, great. Do we have a hardened config, or is that configuration also insecure? Can we manage the users and accounts in such a way that we really limit who has access to that device? Does that device have an updated whitelisting, right? So the whitelist is locked down, et cetera. Do we have network protections, right? Can we demonstrate through looking at those configs of the firewalls and the VLANs, et cetera, that yes, this device is truly protected behind that firewall? Do we have an updated backup? Was it done in the last 30 days, 90, 180? Did it fail? Did it not? And then how important is that asset to our operations? Right? Is that a critical asset that we're talking about? And so by looking at these compensating controls, we can start to put a risk score to things, right? We can say, okay, I couldn't patch that, but that asset is, got whitelisting, it's in lockdown, it's got updated AV software. We've basically limited all the ports and services to only those most critically required, et cetera. And so having that data in one place allows us to build those compensating controls and demonstrate from an insurance point of view that we're actually achieving that. And configs is just one example of that, right? So as we look across all of the various settings on devices, how green am I? Am I actually compliant with that configuration setting, or am I red, not compliant with that setting? The next topic is network segmentation. Are you segmented? Are you segmented from IT? And are you segmented within the OT environment, right? And so when we look at the configurations of the network, when we look devices, when we look at the flows, when we look at devices on different subnets, right, we start to see risks, right? So by gathering, by going to the endpoint, i.e. that network device, and pulling back the config, or by going to the endpoints, for instance, the PLCs or servers in the environment, I can see dual homed connectivity routing around firewalls, et cetera. I can see things like, remote access coming through. I can see things like limited VLAN separation. I can see things like misconfiguration, right? So yes, we thought we were protected, down below in this firewall, but actually there's a whole bunch of open ports in there, or open paths in my ACLs, et cetera. I won't go through this whole thing, but the point is, from an insurance point of view, I need this, right? Because we need to demonstrate that, yes, we are segmented, but also from a security point of view, I need to be able to understand where my risks are on the network side. And again, but by going directly to those networking devices and pulling back their information, or going directly to the servers and the PLCs, I can pull back their network config information and know if I've got, dual home connectivity, et cetera. And then, the topic of backups. Do you have updated backups? Being able to pull in data. Let's assume you have a Cronus or you've got Veeam or whatever you're using for backups, or you're using a PLC backup like Asset Center or OVZ MDT or something. Being able to demonstrate that you've got these backups and those are up to date, right? Within 30 days was the request on that particular question in the survey or in the questionnaire from the insurance companies. You have to decide as an organization, what is your standard? But being able to know, okay, here are all the backups. Here's how much space did it, what's the status? Okay, we were successful. We had failure. To be able to know for each asset, what's the, how up to date is it? Because in that, that graphic I showed very much at the beginning, right? Disaster recovery, backups is a key part of the overall protection program. And then they also ask about things like, are you doing tabletops? Are you doing pen tests, et cetera? And as we all know, doing a pen test in control systems is really risky and challenging, because I have a, if I start to try and do active pen tests, I could trip the plant, right? I could start doing things that could cause damage. And so oftentimes pen tests are done in a very limited way, I'll say. By having the data that we're talking about in a single platform, we can start to do things like digital twins for tabletops and or pen tests, meaning we know the environment, right? We know, okay, here's where the network configs are at risk. Here's where the vulnerabilities are. Here's where there are dual NICs in your environment, et cetera. And so we can build a variety of testing using that essentially virtual twin, digital twin of your actual control systems. And so without having to go and do an actual pen test, we can run multiple scenarios of how an attacker would penetrate. And we can actually use the actual attack patterns of the various attack groups, right? They're all known, or not, they're all known, sorry. There are a bunch of them that are well known that we can use from threat intel, et cetera. And then we can model those patterns and see, okay, would our controls have stopped that attack without having to actually pen test the actual environment, which obviously can create significant risks. So again, insurance is asking for something that is, should be part of our core NIST CSF practices around testing and tabletopping, et cetera. And the great news is, if you get all this data, all this endpoint data into a platform, you can actually do this through digital twins. And by doing that, you can then identify these problems and actually go and fix it, right? So I can remove, we do this all the time, and we'll find dozens and dozens of software on these control systems that aren't necessary, right? Like TeamViewer, right? When we go in and do an inventory, you got TeamViewer, you got Log Me In, you got iTunes, you got DVD burners, all sorts of things that are on there, right? No need, let's get them off. We can monitor for anomalous file access and encryption going on a device, right? We can put little canary files in and basically spot ransomware before it happens. We can remove those dual home NICs. We can identify and improve network traffic, et cetera. Point is that by looking at this data in detail, we can see where the problems are, and then we can go fix them, right? So as we think about the overall security strategies, we can start to layer in protections and additional detection elements. And so as we think more broadly about being able to deal with these new requirements for OT cyber, the conceptual point here is we want to start with that assessment. We want to start understanding, where are we? Where are we on a policy basis, right? Do we actually have robust OT security policies, right? We start to gather basic logs for doing detections. We then want to get that inventory and really know where we are, right? What's our risks? What are our vulnerabilities? What patches are we needed? Are we doing backups, et cetera? Then typically there's a remediate phase where we start to improve all of those things, right? So we're going to start patching. We're going to start removing software that shouldn't be there, remove users that shouldn't be there, harden configs. And then to maintain that insurance, we have to maintain that process, right? We have to be able to prove that we're doing this on a regular basis, right? And that leads to a whole number of things around monitoring, around monitoring for status of backups and AV, et cetera. And in terms of how we do that, we prioritize specific actions, right? So there's some things we can do right away. You know, we got a bunch of capabilities we already have, right? We got a firewall, let's say, but that firewall is being bridged with dual NICs because somebody decided that Fred on the weekend needed to get into the system. And so didn't want to go through the firewall and create a dual NIC around it. As just one example. Okay, so let's get that back through the firewall since we already have the hardware there. I won't go through this whole thing, but the point is to be able to take that visibility we now have of our risks and lay out a program of what we're going to do to remediate those, and then over time maintain them. And from a security point of view, this is critical, but from an insurance point of view, it is equally important because we need to be able to show that, yes, we are taking actions. We do have a roadmap to continually improve the security of our OT environment. So what's the advantage of this approach? Back to the insurance question at hand here. So number one is we're able to demonstrate that enterprise asset inventory that's being requested. Number two, we're able to do that at a much, much reduced cost than what we'd get from manual data collection or putting in spans and taps and fiber and everywhere to go get network traffic, et cetera. Number three, we can have that comprehensive data in one place. All right, so we're not hunting down, oh, did we do that? Or yeah, our backup's up to date. Oh, let's get all of the plants to send us their backup data. It's all right there. Yes, we are doing that. We can do these pen tests because we have all this data in the platform. We can start to do these digital twin pen tests and see how secure we really are. From an insurance point of view, we can check that box, but we can also actually, from a security point of view, know where our bigger gaps are. And then finally, it improves the security insurance strategy because we now know in that stack on page one, right? We know, okay, are our policies in place? Are we trained? Number two, are our protections in place, right? So we said part of our strategy is to protect. Okay, is AV up to date? Are we patched? Do we have network segmentation that's effective? Our next strategy was detection. Great. So the platform will say, great, yes, we are doing our monitoring. We're able to identify risks and threats, et cetera. Next step. Okay, are we ready for disaster recovery? Yep. Do we have backups? Are the backups up to date? Are we backing up all of our devices, et cetera, et cetera? And so by having the data in a database like this, in a platform like this, it allows you to not only check a box for insurance, but also make sure that we're understanding how insurance fits into all of the other pieces of the overall OT cybersecurity program. So with that, I'll draw us to a close for the webinar. Hopefully that was helpful just in terms of understanding what's going on in the insurance space, what's being required, what are some of the challenges, and how are we gathering the ability to actually manage against those cybersecurity requirements as well as the insurance requirements. So if anyone has questions, please do put them in the chat or in Q&A. One note to everyone knows, we will be sending out a copy of this document. I know there's a lot of content in there. We'll be sending out a copy of the document as well as a link to the video should you need that in the future. So there is a question, do you use your own Verve OT asset inventory tool or do you use one of the others, Armis, et cetera? So explicitly, we use Verve's inventory. Now, could we get data from other tools? Yes, we integrate with a bunch of tools. But the reason we do this is all of the four you've mentioned there are using network traffic to try to get endpoint data. So they're using essentially a network intrusion detection tool. They're putting a span or a tap or something like that on your network devices, and they're monitoring the traffic. And then they try and do packet inspection of that to identify what the asset is at the other end. That's been done historically because without deep understanding of control systems, if you try to be quote unquote active, there could be a disruption. Verve, because of our 30 years of experience in control systems, had built a very different way of getting that data, right? To my point of before, we are endpoint, not network. So we're literally going to the endpoints and directly getting the data from the endpoints. So with a Windows, Unix, Linux device, we'll put a vendor agnostic OT agent on that device, and we'll gather literally hundreds of different pieces of data directly from the device. And for the embedded devices, we'll communicate with them in their native protocol, and we'll essentially ask the device to send us all of its key data. And so it's a much deeper view, as well as a much more certain view of things like vulnerabilities, et cetera. What are the cyber insurance agencies? What are cyber insurance agencies used to check after the attacks to provide the cyber insurance money? I think that question is asking, what are they, if you get attacked, how do they know to give you the money? And so what they will look at is they'll look at what's written into the policy and what's written into the exclusions. They will then say, okay, is this covered? Let's say it's a ransomware payment. Is ransomware payment covered? For the most part, insurances ransomware payments are included in those. Then the question will be, okay, but did you meet the requirements of the insurance? i.e., did you actually have an inventory? Were you doing pen tests? Did you have patch management? They will start to then ask the questions of, well, can I get out of paying you because you weren't doing what was required according to the contract, or you told me you were and you weren't. And so then they'll dive into, okay, can you prove that you were doing these? Now, obviously, if it's a small amount, you'd probably pay it, right? But as you get into larger amounts, I think the perfect example of this is the Merck situation, where the insurers essentially refused to pay Merck originally because they said it was an act of war for the NotPetya attack. Now, eventually they went to court, and Merck won, and they got paid $1 billion or something, I think, by the insurers. But the point is that they're going to ask all these questions about what you were doing, and they'll look into those things before they'll pay you a significant amount of money anyway. So hopefully that was helpful. We're coming to the end of the time. We really appreciate everybody joining. We are going to do another webinar in December. We're still picking the date, probably the first week of December, and that will be on trying to put together an overall program. So we were at a couple of conferences lately, and a lot of companies came up to us and said, oh my God, like there's all these different things, all these different companies, as well as all these different things I need to do for cyber. And the reality is, to do OT cyber, it's not one thing. There is no quote unquote silver bullet, right? There are going to be a range of things. There's going to be firewalls, there's going to be policies. And so we're going to talk about, how to think about the overall program and putting all the various pieces together over time. So anyway, hope this was helpful for everybody today. Thanks for your time. And as I said, we will be sending out a copy of this and a copy of the document. Thanks so much.